I thought the worst day of my life was June 15th, 1973, when I watched my sister Catherine walk down the aisle in the wedding dress I was supposed to wear, marrying the man who was supposed to be mine. But I was wrong. The worst day of my life was last Tuesday, when I found the letter that explained why she did it. My name is Margaret Rose Sullivan, Maggie to those who knew me when I was young and foolish enough to believe that family meant loyalty. I'm 77 years old now, sitting in my small apartment in Portland, Oregon, holding a piece of paper that's turned my entire life into a lie. Catherine died 3 weeks ago. Pancreatic cancer, quick and merciless, just like she was when she decided to destroy my life 50 years ago. I hadn't spoken to her in all that time, not one word since the day she married Thomas Mitchell, the boy I'd loved since I was 16 years old. I was cleaning out her house in Sacramento when I found it, tucked inside the pages of her old copy of Jane Eyre, the same book Thomas had given me for my 18th birthday, with a note saying I reminded him of the heroine because I was strong and true, with a heart pure enough to love without conditions. The letter was written in Catherine's careful handwriting, dated June 10th, 1973, 5 days before her wedding to my Thomas. The envelope was addressed to someone named Dr. Helen Morrison in San Francisco, but it was never sent. Never mailed, just hidden away like the secret it contained. "Dear Dr. Morrison," it began, "I'm writing to thank you for agreeing to keep my condition confidential, even from my family. The surgery went well, and the recovery has been easier than expected. You were right that telling them about the cancer would only cause unnecessary worry, especially since the prognosis is so uncertain. Cancer. My 22-year-old sister had cancer in 1973, and she never told anyone in our family. But that wasn't the part that made my hands shake so badly I nearly dropped the letter. The part that destroyed me was what came next. The hardest part hasn't been the physical pain. It's been knowing what I have to do to protect Maggie. She can never know that I'm dying. If she knew, she'd sacrifice everything to take care of me, including her chance at happiness with Thomas. I've watched them together for 3 years, and I know what they have is real love. The kind that comes once in a lifetime if you're lucky. I had to stop reading. Had to put the letter down and walk to the kitchen for a glass of water because the room was spinning and nothing made sense anymore. For 50 years, I'd lived with the burning hatred of believing my sister had stolen the man I loved out of jealousy, out of meanness, out of some twisted need to have everything I wanted. I'd built my entire adult life around that betrayal, letting it poison every relationship I'd tried to have since then. But the letter wasn't finished destroying me. The doctors say I have maybe 18 months if I'm lucky, 6 months if I'm not. Thomas doesn't know about the cancer, but he's noticed I've been different since the diagnosis, more affectionate, more desperate to spend time with him. I think he believes he's falling in love with me, but I know better. He's just responding to the intensity of someone who knows she's dying. My sister believed she was dying when she seduced my boyfriend. She thought she had 6 to 18 months to live. I've convinced Thomas that Maggie has been seeing someone else behind his back. I showed him fake letters I wrote in her handwriting, letters that make it look like she's been having an affair with David Brennan from her work. Thomas is heartbroken, but he believes it. Yesterday, he asked me to marry him. He says if Maggie can betray him, then maybe what he needs is someone who truly appreciates him. The fake letters. The lies about me having an affair with David Brennan, who was nothing more than a friendly co-worker I sometimes had lunch with. I remembered how confused and hurt I'd been when Thomas suddenly turned cold toward me, when he started accusing me of things I'd never done, and when he stopped returning my calls. I'd begged him to tell me what was wrong and pleaded with him to explain why he was pulling away from me. But he just looked at me with disgust and said he knew about David, knew about the lies I'd been telling, and knew I wasn't the person he thought I was. I'd tried to defend myself, tried to explain that there was nothing between David and me, but Thomas wouldn't listen. And then, 2 weeks later, Catherine announced that she and Thomas were getting married. "I know this makes me a terrible person," the letter continued. "I know Maggie will never forgive me, and I don't expect her to. But I also know that if she knew I was dying, she'd insist on nursing me through it instead of starting her own life. She'd waste the best years of her youth playing caretaker to a dying woman. And then when I was gone, she'd be alone with nothing but regrets." The cruelest part of all was what came at the end of the letter. "The truth is, I'm not doing this just to protect Maggie from wasting her life on me. I'm doing it because I've been in love with Thomas Mitchell since the day she brought him home 3 years ago. I've hidden it, pretended to be happy for them, and played the supportive sister while my heart broke every time I watched them together. Now that I'm dying, I want to know what it feels like to be loved by him, even if it's built on lies. Even if it only lasts as long as I do. I'm sorry, Maggie. Someday, I hope you'll understand." The letter was signed Catherine and dated 5 days before the wedding that destroyed my life. But Catherine didn't die in 18 months. She didn't die in 6 months. She lived for 50 years after writing that letter, 50 years married to the man I loved. 50 years of letting me believe she'd betrayed me out of selfishness instead of love. The cancer she thought would kill her went into remission. The marriage she thought would last only months lasted 5 decades. And I spent half a century hating her for stealing my happiness when she thought she was saving my life. The worst part? She was right about one thing. If I'd known she was dying, I would have dropped everything to take care of her. I would have given up on you, Thomas, given up on college, and given up on every dream I had to nurse my sister through what we thought would be her final months. Instead, she made me hate her so completely that I refused to even attend her funeral. After I found Catherine's letter, I spent 3 days in bed, unable to eat, unable to sleep, and unable to do anything but stare at the ceiling and try to understand how everything I'd believed about my life had been wrong. I'd built 50 years of choices on the foundation of my sister's betrayal. Every decision I'd made, every relationship I'd rejected, every moment of bitterness and anger and loneliness. All of it based on a lie she'd told to protect me from a truth she thought would destroy me. The morning after Catherine's wedding in 1973, I'd packed everything I owned into my old Volkswagen Beetle and driven from Sacramento to Portland without telling anyone where I was going. I was 21 years old, heartbroken, and convinced that family was just another word for people who would stab you in the back when it suited them. Portland in 1973 was a different city than it is now. Smaller, grittier, and full of people who'd come there to disappear from their old lives. It suited me perfectly. I found a job as a secretary at a small law firm, rented a studio apartment in the Burnside district, and set about building a life that had nothing to do with the family that had betrayed me. I never called home. When my mother tried to reach me through the law firm, I had my boss tell her I didn't work there anymore. When Catherine sent letters to my old address, my mother forwarded them to the post office box I'd rented, but I threw them away without reading them. I wanted nothing to do with any of them. The loneliness was crushing at first. I'd grown up in a big Irish Catholic family in Sacramento. 4 kids, 2 parents, grandparents who lived next door, and cousins and aunts and uncles who showed up for every birthday and holiday. Suddenly, I was completely alone in a city where I knew no one, working a job that barely paid enough for rent and groceries. But I was stubborn and I was angry, and those 2 emotions carried me through the worst of it. I threw myself into work with the intensity of someone who had nothing else to live for. Within 2 years, I'd been promoted from secretary to paralegal. Within 5 years, I was managing the entire office. By the time I was 30, I was making more money than most of the lawyers I worked for. Men asked me out, of course. Portland was full of young professionals in the 1970s, men who'd moved there for the same reasons I had, to start over, to build something new. But I couldn't trust any of them. Every time a man showed interest in me, I'd remember how Thomas had looked at me with disgust when he accused me of cheating, how quickly he'd believed the worst about me, and how easily he'd transferred his affections to my sister. If the man I'd loved since I was 16 could betray me so completely, how could I trust a stranger? I had relationships, but they never lasted. I'd get close to someone, start to care about them, and then the fear would kick in. What if they left me for someone else? What if they were just pretending to care? What if love was always a lie and I was just too stupid to see it coming? So I'd find reasons to end things before they could end me. I'd pick fights, find flaws, and convince myself that every man I dated was selfish or dishonest or not worth the risk. Better to be alone than to be destroyed again. My co-workers used to joke that I was married to my job, and they weren't wrong. The law firm became my family, my clients became my purpose, and my small apartment became my fortress against a world that I'd learned couldn't be trusted. I worked late every night, came in early every morning, and took cases home on weekends. When the senior partner, Robert Chen, decided to retire in 1985, he asked me to take over the firm. By then, I knew more about running the business than anyone else, had relationships with every important client, and had built a reputation as someone who got results. At 33, I became the youngest person to own a law firm in Portland. It should have been the proudest moment of my life. Instead, it just felt like another way to stay busy enough that I didn't have to think about everything I'd lost. The success brought money, respect, independence, all the things a modern woman was supposed to want. I bought a house in the hills overlooking the city, drove a BMW, and took vacations to Europe and Asia. From the outside, I looked like someone who had it all figured out. But every night, I came home to an empty house and wondered what it would have been like if Catherine hadn't stolen Thomas. Would we have gotten married? Had children? Built the kind of life I saw my clients fighting over in their divorce proceedings? The wondering turned into bitterness, and the bitterness became a poison that colored everything. I began to see betrayal everywhere, in the way married clients looked at younger paralegals, in the way business partners tried to cheat each other, and in the way children fought over their parents' estates. Love was an illusion, family was a lie, and trust was just another word for stupidity. I became known as the lawyer you hired when you wanted to destroy someone in court. Divorce cases, business disputes, estate battles, I approached them all with the cold efficiency of someone who'd learned that nice people finished last, and that the only way to survive was to strike first and show no mercy. My reputation grew. Wealthy clients sought me out specifically because they knew I'd do whatever it took to win. I charged premium fees and delivered results that other lawyers couldn't match, not because I was more skilled, but because I was more ruthless. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd become successful by helping other people destroy their families, just like mine had been destroyed. Every divorce I won, every business partnership I dissolved, every inheritance dispute I settled in my client's favor. It all felt like revenge against the world that had taught me that people couldn't be trusted. But success built on bitterness is hollow. And by the time I turned 50, I was exhausted by my own anger. I'd spent nearly 30 years proving that I didn't need anyone, and the victory felt like a defeat. I tried therapy for a while, thinking maybe I could learn to let go of the past. But every session just reminded me of why I couldn't trust people. The therapist, Dr. Sarah Kim, was kind and patient, and everything a good therapist should be. But she couldn't change the fundamental fact that my sister had betrayed me, and my first love had chosen her over me. Maggie, Dr. Kim would say, what if you tried reaching out to your sister? What if there's more to the story than you know? But I couldn't imagine what more there could be. I'd seen them together at their wedding, Catherine glowing with happiness, Thomas looking at her like she was the only woman in the world, What was complicated about that? She'd wanted him, so she'd taken him. End of story. I stopped going to therapy after 6 months. Some wounds, I decided, were too deep to heal. Some betrayals were too complete to forgive. Better to build a life that didn't require trust, didn't depend on other people, and didn't leave room for the kind of devastating disappointment that had nearly destroyed me when I was 21. By the time I turned 60, I'd accepted that I would spend the rest of my life alone. I had my work, my house, and my routine. It wasn't the life I'd dreamed of when I was young, but it was safe, predictable, mine. I told myself it was enough. I told myself I was happy. I told myself that being alone by choice was better than being abandoned by people you trusted. But late at night, in the quiet of my empty house, I sometimes wondered what Thomas was doing. Whether he was happy with Catherine, whether he ever thought about the girl he'd loved before her, the girl he'd accused of betraying him before throwing her away like yesterday's newspaper. I never tried to find out. Some mysteries, I thought, were better left unsolved. I was wrong about that too. In 2010, when I was 58 years old, I received a phone call that forced me to confront the family I'd spent 37 years avoiding. My mother was dying. The voice on the phone belonged to my brother Patrick, who'd tracked me down through the Oregon State Bar Association. We hadn't spoken since I'd left Sacramento, and hearing his voice after all those years made me feel like I was 21 again, raw and angry and desperately sad. "Maggie," he said, and I could hear the strain in his voice. "I know you don't want to talk to any of us, but Mom's in the hospital. The doctors say it's pneumonia, but she's not responding to treatment. She's been asking for you, my mother, the woman who'd raised 4 children through the Depression and World War II, who'd worked double shifts at the cannery to help pay for our educations, who'd never raised her voice even when we deserved it. She was 86 years old, and she was dying without ever knowing why her youngest daughter had disappeared from her life. Is Catherine there?" I asked, surprised by how hard it was to say her name out loud, every day. She and Thomas both. They never had kids, you know. Mom's been like their whole family, never had kids. For some reason, that hit me harder than anything else Patrick had said. Catherine and Thomas had been married for 37 years, and they'd never had children. In all my imaginings of their life together, I'd pictured them with a house full of babies, the children that should have been mine. "Maggie? Are you still there?" "I'm here. Patrick, I don't think I can come. It's been too long. Too much has happened. She forgave you years ago for whatever happened between you and Catherine. She never understood it, but she forgave you. The least you can do is let her say goodbye." Patrick gave me the hospital information and hung up before I could change my mind. I sat in my office for the rest of the day, staring out the window at the Portland skyline, trying to decide whether I was brave enough to face the life I'd run away from. The flight to Sacramento took 90 minutes, but it felt like traveling back in time. Everything looked smaller than I remembered. The airport, the streets, even the hospital where my mother lay dying. 37 years had changed me more than I'd realized. I wasn't the heartbroken girl who'd fled to Portland anymore. I was a successful businesswoman in an expensive suit, driving a rental car to see a family that had become strangers. Patrick met me in the hospital lobby. He was 55 then, gray-haired and thick around the middle, wearing a mechanic's uniform that smelled like motor oil and honest work. He looked like our father had looked, and seeing him made my chest tight with memories I'd spent decades trying to forget. "You came," he said simply, and hugged me like no time had passed at all. "She's going to be so happy." My mother was asleep when we walked into her room, looking tiny and fragile against the white hospital sheets. The strong woman who'd raised 4 children and buried a husband had been reduced to bones and paper skin. But she still had the same peaceful expression she'd worn when she used to sleep in her recliner after Sunday dinner. The doctor says she's been hanging on. Waiting for something, Patrick whispered. I think she was waiting for you. We sat with her for hours, Patrick filling me in on 37 years of family history I'd missed. Our older brother Michael had become a teacher, married a nurse named Linda, and had 3 kids who were all grown now with children of their own. Our sister Beth had died in a car accident in 1995, a fact that hit me like a physical blow. I'd had a sister and she'd died and I hadn't even known. Why didn't anyone tell me? I asked. We tried. Catherine found your address somehow and sent you a letter about the funeral. When you didn't respond, we figured you really didn't want anything to do with us anymore. I'd received that letter. I remembered throwing it away without opening it, just like all the others Catherine had sent over the years. Now I realized I'd thrown away the news of my own sister's death. What about Catherine? I asked. You said she and Thomas never had kids. Patrick was quiet for a long moment. She couldn't, he said finally. Something about the cancer treatment she had when she was young. The doctors told her it was a side effect of the chemotherapy. Cancer treatment. Chemotherapy. The words hit me like ice water. What cancer treatment? The ovarian cancer she had in the early 70s, right before she married Thomas. She nearly died from it, but she kept it secret from everyone except Mom and Dad. Didn't want people treating her like she was fragile or dying. The room started spinning. Cancer in the early 70s, right before she married Thomas. She'd kept it secret from everyone. Patrick, I said carefully, are you saying Catherine had cancer when she was 22? Oh yeah, really bad case too. The doctors gave her maybe a year to live. She went through months of chemotherapy, lost all her hair, and got so sick she could barely stand up. But she beat it, went into remission right after the wedding, and stayed healthy for decades. Lucky thing too, because back then, ovarian cancer was basically a death sentence for someone her age. I excused myself and walked to the bathroom, where I splashed cold water on my face and tried to process what Patrick had just told me. Catherine really had been dying in 1973. The letter I'd found in her house wasn't the fantasy of a guilty woman trying to rewrite history. It was the truth. My sister had stolen my boyfriend because she thought she had months to live, and she wanted to experience being loved by him before she died. And somehow, impossibly, she'd survived. When I came back to the room, my mother was awake. Maggie, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Is that really you, sweetheart? I took her hand, which felt like paper and bird bones. I'm here, Mom. I knew you'd come. I told Patrick you'd come when it mattered. She squeezed my fingers with what little strength she had left. I never understood what happened between you and Catherine, but I never stopped loving you. Never stopped hoping you'd come home. We talked for 2 hours. Not about the past, not about why I'd left, just about the present moment. She told me about her garden, about the soap operas she watched, and about how proud she was of the successful woman I'd become. I told her about my work, my house, and my life in Portland, leaving out the loneliness, the bitterness, and the decades of anger that had defined my adult life. She died that night, peacefully, with all her surviving children holding her hands. The funeral was 3 days later. The whole family was there, cousins I hadn't seen since childhood, aunts and uncles who looked at me like I was a ghost, and nieces and nephews I'd never met. And Catherine, she was 60 years old then, still beautiful in the way that women who've lived fully become beautiful. Her hair was silver, her face lined with laugh lines and worry lines in equal measure. She wore a simple black dress and carried herself with the dignity of someone who'd loved deeply and lost much. When she saw me across the church, she didn't try to approach me. She just nodded once, a small acknowledgement that said she understood I was there for our mother, not for her. But I couldn't stop watching her during the service. She cried when the priest talked about Mom's devotion to her family. She laughed when Patrick told stories about Mom's terrible cooking and stubborn streak. She looked like someone who'd spent 60 years learning how to live with the consequences of an impossible choice. After the service, as people gathered in the parish hall for lunch, Catherine walked up to me. "Thank you for coming," she said simply. It meant everything to her. "I should have come sooner. Maybe. But you came when it mattered most." She paused, looking like she wanted to say more, then seemed to change her mind. "I hope your life in Portland has been good, Maggie. I hope you've been happy." It was such a simple thing to say, but something in her voice, a sadness, a weariness, a regret that went deeper than words, made me realize that maybe I wasn't the only one who'd spent the last 37 years living with the consequences of that summer in 1973. "Catherine," I started to say, but she was already walking away. I left Sacramento the next day without speaking to her again. But for the first time in decades, I found myself wondering if there was more to the story than I'd understood. Maybe the woman who'd stolen my boyfriend had paid a price for it that I'd never considered. It would be 13 more years before I found out just how high that price had been. For 13 years after my mother's funeral, I tried to go back to the life I'd built in Portland, but something had fundamentally shifted. The anger that had sustained me for nearly 4 decades was beginning to crack, and underneath it was something I'd never allowed myself to feel: doubt. I found myself thinking about Catherine at odd moments while reviewing contracts, while walking through my empty house, while lying awake at 3 a.m., wondering what my life might have been like if I'd made different choices. Not thinking about what she'd done to me, but thinking about her, the woman I'd once known better than anyone, who'd shared a bedroom with me for 18 years, who'd taught me how to French braid my hair and how to talk to boys. Had she been happy with Thomas? Had their marriage been everything she'd dreamed it would be when she stole him from me? Or had she spent 50 years living with the guilt of building her happiness on the ruins of mine? I began to pay attention to news from Sacramento, checking online for any mention of the families I'd once been part of. I learned that Thomas had become a high school principal, that he'd coached baseball, and that he'd been beloved by students and parents alike. I learned that he and Catherine had been active in their church, that they'd traveled extensively, and that they'd been foster parents for a while in the 1980s when they realized they couldn't have children of their own. From the outside, they'd had a good life. But I'd learned enough about human nature during my decades as a lawyer to know that appearances could be deceiving, that the happiest-looking couples often carried the deepest secrets. In 2020, when the pandemic forced the world to slow down, I found myself with more time to think than I'd had in years. My law firm was running itself by then. I'd hired excellent partners and could afford to step back from the day-to-day operations. For the first time since I was 21, I had nowhere to run from my own thoughts. That's when I started writing letters to Catherine that I never sent. At first, they were angry letters full of all the things I'd wanted to say to her for 50 years. How could you do that to me? How could you steal the man I loved and then live happily ever after while I spent half a century alone? How could you let me hate you without ever trying to explain? But as weeks turned into months, the letters became more complicated. I started writing about my life in Portland, about the loneliness and the success and the choices I'd made. I wrote about the men I'd pushed away, about the family I'd avoided, and about the bitterness that had defined me for so long that I didn't know who I'd be without it. I wrote about wondering if she'd ever thought about me during her 50 years with Thomas, if she'd ever regretted the choice she'd made, if she'd ever loved him as much as I had, or if marriage to him had felt like living with a beautiful lie. I never sent any of the letters, but writing them helped me understand something I'd been avoiding for decades. I missed her. Not just the boyfriend she'd stolen, but her, my sister, the person who'd known me before I became Margaret Rose Sullivan, Esquire, before I became the Ice Queen of Portland family law, Before I became a woman who trusted no one and needed nothing, Catherine had known Maggie Sullivan, the girl who believed in happy endings and thought family meant forever. And maybe somewhere underneath all the hurt and anger and years of silence, that girl was still there, wondering if it was too late to find her way home. In March of 2023, I was diagnosed with my own health scare, a suspicious mammogram that turned out to be benign, but gave me weeks of sleepless nights contemplating my own mortality. At 71, I was forced to confront the fact that I wasn't going to live forever, that the time for holding grudges and nursing old wounds was running out. That's when I decided to write one final letter to Catherine. Not an angry letter or a sad letter, but an honest one. I wanted to tell her that I was tired of hating her, tired of carrying 50 years of bitterness like a stone in my chest. I wanted to ask if there was any way, at our age, to find some kind of peace with the past. I spent weeks crafting that letter, rewriting it until every word felt true. I told her about my life in Portland, about the success and the loneliness in equal measure. I told her about the men I'd never married, the children I'd never had, and the family I'd lost when I decided that loving people was too dangerous. But I also told her something else. That despite everything, despite 50 years of anger and hurt, I'd never stopped being glad that she'd survived the cancer that could have killed her when we were young. That, however much I'd hated what she'd done, I'd never wanted her to die for it. I ended the letter with a simple question. Is there anything you want to say to me before it's too late for both of us? I sent it to her last known address in Sacramento, not knowing if she still lived there, not knowing if she'd even want to hear from me after all these years. 2 weeks later, I received a phone call from a hospice worker named Janet. Miss Sullivan? I'm calling about your sister, Catherine Mitchell. She asked me to contact you. My heart stopped. Is she? She's dying, Miss Sullivan. Pancreatic cancer. She has maybe days left, and she's been asking for you. She has something she needs to give you. I was on a plane to Sacramento within 6 hours. The hospice facility was a peaceful place, full of soft colors and gentle music, designed to make dying as comfortable as possible. Catherine was in a private room overlooking a garden, and when I walked in, I barely recognized the woman lying in the hospital bed. Cancer had reduced her to bones and translucent skin, but her eyes were still the same green eyes I remembered from childhood. When she saw me, she smiled, and for a moment, she looked like the sister I'd once shared everything with. You came, she whispered. I wasn't sure you would. I got your message. Through Janet. I have something for you. She gestured weakly toward the nightstand beside her bed, in the drawer. I've been carrying it for 50 years, waiting for the right time to give it to you. I opened the drawer and found an envelope with my name on it, yellowed with age. Inside was a letter in my own handwriting, dated June 1973. It was a love letter. A letter I'd written to Thomas but never sent, because Catherine had married him before I'd found the courage. A letter full of all the things I'd wanted to say to him, all the plans I'd had for our future, and all the love I'd carried for him since I was 16 years old. How did you get this? I asked. I found it in your room after you left. You'd hidden it under your mattress. Catherine's voice was getting weaker, but her words were clear. I read it and I realized what I'd taken from you. Not just Thomas, but your whole future, everything you'd dreamed of. I stared at the letter, remembering the girl who'd written it. So full of hope, so certain that love was enough to overcome anything. Catherine, I said, I need to know. Was it worth it? 50 years with him. Was it worth what it cost both of us? She was quiet for so long I thought she'd fallen asleep. Then she opened her eyes and looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. There's something else in the drawer, she said. Something I should have given you 50 years ago. The second envelope was thicker than the first, and when I opened it, I found something I'd never expected to see. Dozens of letters addressed to me, all from Thomas. all dated between 1973 and 1975. "He wrote to you?" Catherine whispered from her hospital bed. "For 2 years after you left Sacramento, he wrote to you almost every week. I intercepted every letter. My hands were shaking as I opened the first one, dated July 1973, just a month after Catherine's wedding. 'My dearest Maggie,' it began. 'I don't know where you are or if you'll ever read this, but I have to try to reach you. I have to try to explain what happened, why I believed what I believed, and why I married Catherine when my heart still belongs to you.' I sat down hard in the chair beside Catherine's bed, staring at Thomas's familiar handwriting, his careful script that I remembered from the love notes he used to slip into my locker at school. 'I know you think I betrayed you,' the letter continued. 'I know you think I chose Catherine over you because I stopped loving you or because she was somehow better than you. But Maggie, that's not what happened. I married Catherine because I thought you had betrayed me first.' The room was spinning. 50 years later, and I was finally hearing Thomas's side of the story. Someone showed me letters they said you wrote to David Brennan. Love letters. Letters that talked about how you were tired of being with someone as boring as me, and how you were planning to leave me for someone more exciting. I was devastated, Maggie. I confronted you about them, but you seemed so confused and so defensive. I thought you were lying to cover up the affair, David Brennan, the co-worker I'd sometimes had lunch with, the fake affair Catherine had invented to drive Thomas away from me. I was heartbroken and angry. And when Catherine came to comfort me, when she told me that she'd suspected something was going on, but hadn't wanted to hurt me by telling me, I thought she was the only person who really cared about me. I married her on the rebound, Maggie. I married her because I thought you had thrown our love away. I looked up at Catherine, who was watching me read with tears in her eyes. 'You wrote fake love letters from me to David,' I said. 'It wasn't a question. Yes,' she whispered. 'I was desperate. I was dying and I was in love with him, and I thought if he believed you'd betrayed him, he might turn to me. I never meant for it to go as far as marriage. I thought I'd be dead within months, and then he'd discover the truth, and you two could find your way back to each other.' But she hadn't died. She'd lived for 50 years with a man she'd stolen through lies, while I'd spent the same 50 years believing both of them had betrayed me. I kept reading the letters. In each one, Thomas poured out his heart, begging me to contact him, to explain what had happened, and to give him a chance to make things right. He wrote about their honeymoon, how Catherine had seemed distant and sad, and how she'd cried on their wedding night for reasons she wouldn't explain. She keeps saying she's sorry. He wrote in one letter from August 1973, "She keeps acting like she's done something terrible. But when I ask her what's wrong, she just says she's tired. Maggie, I think I made a mistake. I think I married the wrong sister." By November 1973, his letters had become desperate. "I tried to call your old number, but it's been disconnected. Your mother won't tell me where you are. She just says you need time and space and that if you wanted to talk to me, you would. But Maggie, I can't live like this. I can't be married to Catherine while I'm still in love with you. It's not fair to any of us." The last letter was dated December 1975, more than 2 years after I'd left Sacramento. "This is the last letter I'm going to write," Thomas had written. "Catherine is pregnant, and we're both trying to make this marriage work for the sake of the baby. But I want you to know that if you ever change your mind, if you ever want to come home and fight for what we had, I'll leave everything to be with you. I love Catherine, but I'll never love anyone the way I loved you, pregnant." I looked at Catherine, remembering what Patrick had told me years earlier. "You were never pregnant," I said. "False alarm," Catherine said weakly. "The doctors thought I might be, but it turned out to be side effects from the cancer treatment." By the time we realized the mistake, Thomas had already decided to commit to the marriage. He said if we were going to make it work, we had to stop looking backward. So he never knew. About the fake letters, about your cancer, about any of it. I tried to tell him so many times over the years. But how do you confess to your husband that your entire marriage is built on lies? How do you tell someone you love that you stole them from the person they really wanted to be with? I set the letters down and looked at this woman who had shaped my entire adult life through one desperate act when she thought she was dying. Were you happy? I asked. In 50 years of marriage built on lies, were you ever actually happy? Catherine was crying now, tears running down her sunken cheeks. Some days, when I could forget how it started, when I could pretend that he'd chosen me because he loved me and not because he thought you'd betrayed him, when I could believe that what we had was real. And Thomas? I think he was content. We had a good life together, Maggie. We traveled, we volunteered at the church, and we took care of your mother in her last years. But there was always something missing. Some spark that never quite caught fire, some depth of feeling that I could never quite reach in him. She paused, struggling to breathe. He used to call out your name in his sleep, she said quietly. Even after 40 years of marriage, he'd sometimes wake up calling for you. He never knew he was doing it, and I never told him. But I always knew that part of his heart was still with the girl who'd disappeared without saying goodbye. The cruelty of it hit me like a physical blow. Thomas had spent 50 years married to the wrong woman, thinking I'd betrayed him, never knowing that I'd loved him until the day I died. I'd spent 50 years alone, thinking he'd chosen my sister over me, never knowing that he'd been tricked into it. And Catherine had spent 50 years living with the guilt of knowing she'd destroyed two people's happiness to save herself from a death that never came. I'm sorry, she whispered. I know it doesn't mean anything now, but I'm so sorry, Maggie. I was 22 and terrified and in love with a man who belonged to someone else. I thought I was dying, and I wanted to know what it felt like to be loved by him, just once. Before I was gone, but you didn't die. No. I got the miracle I'd prayed for. The cancer went into remission. But the miracle came with a curse. I got to live, but I had to live with what I'd done. I had to wake up every morning next to a man I'd stolen, knowing that if he ever learned the truth, he'd hate me for it. I sat in silence for a long time, processing 50 years of misunderstanding in the space of an hour. Everything I'd believed, everything I'd built my life on, everything I'd used to justify my loneliness and bitterness, all of it based on a lie told by a terrified girl who thought she was saving her own life. Where is Thomas now? I asked. He died last year. Heart attack. Quick and peaceful the way he lived. Catherine's voice was getting weaker. He never knew about any of this. I thought about telling him when we knew he was dying, but I couldn't. I couldn't take away 50 years of believing he'd made the right choice. So Thomas had died, thinking I'd betrayed him. He'd lived his entire life believing I'd thrown away our love for another man, never knowing that I'd loved him until my last breath. Catherine, I said, I need you to tell me something, and I need you to be completely honest. If you could do it all over again, knowing you'd live for 50 more years, would you still have stolen him from me? She closed her eyes, and for a moment I thought she'd fallen asleep or slipped into unconsciousness. Then she opened them and looked at me with the saddest expression I'd ever seen. Yes, she whispered, I would do it again, because even 50 years of living with the guilt was better than dying without ever knowing what it felt like to be loved by him. Even a marriage built on lies was better than no marriage at all. It was the most honest thing anyone had ever said to me. Catherine died 2 days later, on a quiet Tuesday morning while I was holding her hand. Her last words were, "Tell him I'm sorry," though I wasn't sure if she meant Thomas or me or both of us. Maybe it didn't matter. Some apologies are bigger than the people they're meant for. I stayed in Sacramento for a week after the funeral, going through Catherine's belongings and trying to understand the life she'd built on the foundation of her lies. What I found surprised me, evidence of a woman who'd spent 50 years trying to earn the love she'd stolen. There were photo albums full of pictures of her and Thomas traveling the world. Europe, Asia, South America, everywhere I dreamed of going with him when I was young. But in every photo, Catherine looked like she was performing happiness rather than feeling it. Her smiles were beautiful but somehow hollow, like she was always conscious of the camera, always aware that she was playing a part. I found journals dating back to the early years of their marriage, filled with her private thoughts about guilt and love and the weight of living with secrets. "I love him," she'd written in 1975, "but I don't know if he loves me or if he's just trying to make the best of a mistake." How do you build trust with someone when your entire relationship started with betrayal? There were letters she'd written to me over the years, but never sent, dozens of them, each one an attempt to explain or apologize or justify what she'd done. Reading them was like watching someone try to solve an impossible equation. How do you say sorry for stealing someone's entire life? But there were other things, too. Evidence of a woman who'd tried to honor the love she'd stolen by living up to it. She'd been a devoted wife, a caring daughter-in-law, and a pillar of their community. She'd channeled her guilt into service, volunteering at hospitals and schools, fostering children who needed temporary homes, and trying to put more good into the world than she'd taken out of it. In a box under her bed, I found something that made me cry for the first time since she'd died. Every newspaper clipping about my law career that she could find. Articles about cases I'd won, professional awards I'd received, and mentions of my success in legal journals. She'd been following my life from a distance for 50 years, keeping track of the sister she'd lost through her own actions. On the back of one clipping from 1995, when I'd been named Lawyer of the Year by the Oregon State Bar, she'd written, "She built something amazing out of the pain I caused her. I'm proud of her and ashamed of myself in equal measure." The night before I was scheduled to fly back to Portland, I went to the cemetery where Catherine and Thomas were buried side by side. Their headstone was simple, beloved husband and wife together forever. But I knew the truth now. They'd been together in body for 50 years, but in spirit, part of Thomas had always been with the girl who'd disappeared without saying goodbye. I knelt between their graves and tried to figure out what I was feeling. Not anger anymore. That had burned out somewhere between reading Thomas's letters and watching Catherine die. Not sadness exactly, though there was plenty of that. Something more complicated, something like understanding. Catherine had been 22 years old and dying when she made the choice that defined all our lives. She'd been in love with a man who belonged to someone else, and when she thought she had months to live, she'd decided to steal a little happiness before she was gone. It was selfish and destructive and unforgivable. It was also completely human. If I'd been 22 and dying and in love with someone I couldn't have, would I have made a different choice? If I'd thought I had 6 months to live, would I have been strong enough to do the right thing? I wanted to believe I would have been, but sitting there in the gathering darkness, looking at the graves of the two people who'd shaped my life through their own impossible choices, I wasn't sure. The truth was messier than I'd wanted it to be for 50 years. There was no clear villain in this story, no simple narrative of betrayal and innocence. Just 3 young people who'd loved imperfectly and paid the price for it in different ways. Catherine had gotten the man she wanted, but lived with 50 years of guilt. Thomas had gotten a good wife, but never the love he'd lost. And I had gotten my freedom, but used it to build a fortress around my heart that no one could penetrate. We'd all been punished for her one desperate act, but we'd also all been responsible for how we'd chosen to live with the consequences. I could have tried to contact Thomas after I read his letters. I could have fought for him instead of running away. I could have demanded the truth instead of accepting Catherine's lies at face value. I could have built a life based on love instead of bitterness, but I hadn't. I'd chosen anger over investigation, pride over forgiveness, and safety over vulnerability. Catherine had stolen my first love, but I had stolen my own chance at finding love again. That realization should have been devastating. Instead, it felt like liberation. For 50 years, I'd been the victim in my own story, the woman whose life had been ruined by someone else's selfishness. But sitting in that cemetery, I realized that I'd been the author of my own story all along. Catherine had written the first chapter, but I'd written all the others, and if I were the author, that would mean I could still write a different ending. I was 77 years old. I had money, health, and maybe 10 or 15 good years left if I was lucky. I could spend those years the way I'd spent the last 50, alone, bitter, nursing old wounds, and protecting myself from new ones. Or I could try to live the way I should have lived all along. With an open heart, with trust, with the understanding that love is always a risk, but isolation is a guarantee of emptiness. Standing up from Catherine's grave, I made a decision that would have terrified the 21-year-old girl who'd fled Sacramento in 1973. I was going to go home to Portland and try to build a life based on connection instead of protection. I was going to try to love again, even if it was scary, even if I might get hurt, even if it was almost too late. Catherine had stolen 50 years from me, but she'd also, in the strangest way, given me a gift. She'd shown me that even lies told out of love could destroy people, but also that the human heart was capable of carrying enormous guilt and still finding moments of happiness. If she could live with the weight of what she'd done, maybe I could learn to live with the weight of what I'd failed to do. 6 months after Catherine's funeral, I did something I hadn't done in 50 years. I went on a date. His name was James Morrison, Dr. James Morrison, and I met him at a grief counseling group I'd joined after returning to Portland. He was 80 years old, a retired literature professor whose wife had died of Alzheimer's 3 years earlier. He had kind eyes, gentle hands, and the patience of someone who'd spent his life teaching young people how to think. "I know this is presumptuous," he'd said after our 4th weekly session. "But would you like to have coffee sometime? Somewhere that isn't a church basement filled with sad people?" I almost said no. For 50 years, saying no had been my default response to any invitation that might lead to vulnerability. But sitting there looking at this man who'd loved his wife for 45 years and was brave enough to risk caring about someone new, I heard Catherine's voice in my head. Even 50 years of living with the guilt was better than dying without ever knowing what it felt like to be loved. "Yes," I said. "I'd like that." Coffee led to dinner. Dinner led to walks along the Columbia River. Walks led to conversations about books and loss, and the strange courage it takes to begin again when you're old enough to know how easily things can end. James had his own story of love and betrayal, a first marriage that had ended when his wife left him for his best friend, years of bitterness and mistrust, and the slow process of learning to open his heart again. He understood why I'd spent 50 years alone. He also understood why I was ready to try something different. "The thing about love when you're our age," he told me one evening as we sat on his porch watching the sunset, "is that you know it's not going to last forever. But maybe that makes it more precious, not less. Maybe knowing that time is limited makes every moment of connection a gift." We didn't rush anything. At 77 and 80, we had the luxury of taking our time, of building trust slowly, of enjoying the simple pleasure of having someone to share meals and books and opinions with. For the first time in my adult life, I experienced what it felt like to be with someone without constantly bracing for the moment they would disappoint or abandon me. 6 months into our relationship, James asked me to marry him. "I know it's crazy," he said. "We're too old for grand romantic gestures, and we probably don't have that many years left together. But Margaret, I'd rather spend whatever time I have left loving you than spend it alone." This time I didn't hesitate. "Yes," I said. "Let's be crazy together." We had a small ceremony in his backyard, officiated by the minister from the grief counseling group, attended by a handful of friends and James's adult children, who'd flown in from various parts of the country to meet the woman their father had fallen in love with. At 78 years old, I became a wife for the first time. It wasn't the life I'd planned when I was 21 and dreaming of a future with Thomas Mitchell. It wasn't the fairy tale romance I'd imagined in my youth. But it was real, and it was mine, and it was built on truth instead of lies. James and I had 3 years together before a stroke took him quietly in his sleep. 3 years of late-night conversations and crossword puzzles and the simple comfort of not being alone. 3 years of learning that love doesn't always look like passion, that sometimes it looks like someone bringing you tea when you're reading, or remembering that you don't like onions in your salad, or holding your hand while you cry about a sister who stole your first love and then spent 50 years regretting it. When James died, I grieved for him the way I'd never allowed myself to grieve for Thomas, cleanly, completely, without the poison of anger or the weight of unfinished business. James and I had said everything we needed to say to each other. We'd held nothing back. His death left me alone again, but it wasn't the same kind of alone I'd known before. It was the alone of someone who'd been fully known and fully loved, who'd taken the risk of caring completely and found it worth the price. Now I'm 81 years old, sitting in the same Portland apartment where I've lived for almost 50 years, but everything about it feels different. The walls that once felt like protection now feel like home. The silence that once felt like loneliness now feels like peace. Yesterday, I received a letter from Thomas and Catherine's church in Sacramento. They're planning a memorial garden in honor of longtime members who've passed, and they asked if I'd like to contribute something in memory of my sister. For the first time in my life, I said yes. I'm donating enough money to plant a rose garden, not because I've forgotten what Catherine did, but because I finally understood why she did it. She was 22 and dying and desperately in love, and she made a choice that saved her life and changed all of ours. Was it right? No. Was it forgivable? I've spent 50 years thinking it wasn't. But now I know better. The truth I've learned at 81 is this: we're all just people making impossible choices with incomplete information, hoping love will be enough to justify the damage we cause along the way. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. But the trying, the willingness to risk everything for love, that's what makes us human. Catherine stole my first love, but she also taught me something precious, that even stolen love is still love, that even lies told from desperation can lead to real happiness, and that forgiveness isn't about forgetting the past. It's about refusing to let the past steal your future. I have maybe 10 good years left, if I'm lucky. I plan to spend them the way I should have spent the last 50, with my heart open, my hand extended, and my faith restored in the messy, complicated, beautiful business of loving imperfect people in an imperfect world. Catherine was wrong to steal Thomas from me, but I was wrong to let that theft steal the rest of my life from me. At 81, I'm finally ready to stop being the woman whose sister betrayed her and start being the woman who learned that love, real love, is always worth the risk of losing it. Some stories end with justice. Some end with revenge. Mine ends with understanding, and that's enough. Thank you for listening to today's story from Granny Story Corner. Life teaches us lessons in the most unexpected ways, doesn't it? If this story touched your heart, please subscribe for more real-life tales that remind us of our shared humanity. Until next time, may your own story be filled with wisdom and love.